What I'm going to cover today, I'm just going to tell you the topics I'm covering. First of all, I'm going to describe to you what I mean by redistricting, what this action is. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the rules for drawing the maps for legislative districts. And then I'm going to talk about the origin of what's called gerrymandering, which is what's happening in Michigan. It means that politicians draw the lines for their own benefit. And then I will talk about the solutions, the possible solutions to the problem of gerrymandering in Michigan, and talk about some proposals to solve the problem, both a range of options that are used in other states, and then I'll talk about the particular option that a group called Voters Not Politicians is well on the way to getting on the November ballot. I'm happy to have you ask questions at any time, because if you get lost or confused about some of this, I don't want to keep talking and have you not understand what I'm talking about. So redistricting is what happens after every census. The Congress, I should say the Constitution requires there to be a census taken every 10 years, and they're taken at the 10s, 2000, 2010, 2020. After that census is taken, we know the population in every state, and we know how the population is distributed across the whole country. And so at that point, reapportionment is done, which means that every state gets its proportionate share of members of Congress. Right now, Michigan has 14 members of Congress, and that's down from what it was before we lost so much population. Then each state decides for itself how it's going to draw the lines for those 14 congressional districts. Could you hit the return again, please? There, thank you. And every state determines its own process. So how are these maps drawn? Next slide. Next slide. Okay, first of all, there are several federal laws that affect this. And these federal laws, of course, apply the same to all the states. The first one is the constitutional requirement that I mentioned earlier. Every 10 years, the lines get, the seats get reapportioned and the state draws the line. The second federal rule is the rule of one person, one vote, which came out of a 1964 case called Reynolds v. Sims, which determined that the congressional districts had to have roughly the same population so that each person's vote had approximately the same weight. This became important in Michigan because Reynolds v. Sims was 1964. In 1963, Michigan had just adopted an entirely new constitution. And Reynolds v. Sims played a role in something that happened about that, which I'll get to in a minute. The third item is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that the state cannot do anything that would deprive minority groups of their right to vote. And then there is a fourth one that's not on this slide, but it's the 14th Amendment, which requires that people not be deprived of liberty or citizen rights without due process of law, and also requires that everybody receives equal protection of the law. So those are the federal rules that affect our, there we go. Okay, so there are state laws as well for drawing the lines. The 1963 Michigan Constitution provided for an independent commission to draw the lines. We will circle back to that because that is the currently proposed solution. Rather than have the legislature draw the lines, to have an independent commission. So you may be thinking, well, geez, if in 1963 there was an independent commission, what happened? Next. What happened is also not on this slide because we've already heard this, but when Reynolds v. Sims meant that the way the lines were to be drawn in Michigan was unconstitutional because the 1963 Constitution required that the districts be equal in geographic scope, same square miles. That's not one person, one vote, right? If you have X number of square miles in the UP and X number of square miles in Grand Rapids, the votes are going to be diluted in the higher population areas. So that was declared unconstitutional, and the state went along with happenstance methods, but finally in 1996, the legislature passed an act that said that the legislature would draw the lines for the state House and the state Senate. And then 3 years later, couple more clicks here, they passed this act in 1999 that allowed the legislature to draw the lines for the US Congress. So that's where we are. So the bottom line is that in Michigan right now, the legislature draws the lines. There are no guidelines for how the lines should be drawn. There are no guidelines for what the relationship of the districts should be to each other, what the shape should be. There are no guidelines. And furthermore, there is no requirement for a public process. And the redistricting lines that were drawn in 2011 were completely done in secret. In fact, they were so secret that the legislature that voted to adopt the new maps, most of the members of the legislature had not seen the maps that they voted to adopt. So, next slide, please. This is a summary of the problem. Partisan politicians manipulate elections to keep themselves and their party in power. Now, you may be wondering how this happened, but before I tell you how it happened, I'm going to say a little bit more about it. Could I have next slide, please? This is a map of a Senate district in Massachusetts that Governor Elbridge Gerry had drawn for the 1810 and 1811. Next hit. This is the map that he drew, and then next. It looked like a salamander. You see the shape of it, and it developed, then they conflated the two terms and changed the way they pronounced his name, and that's where we got gerrymandering. It's in honor of Elbridge Gerry. Okay, last one. And it means redrawing the lines to get a particular result. Okay, now the next slide here is a simplified illustration of gerrymandering. And there are two slides here that will, I hope, illustrate this. And then when I finish with these simplified versions, we'll go on to look at some actual districts in Michigan and see how this gets done. So can you see that there are two different colors up there? Good. Not really. Well, so it's too bad because it probably looks fine on the computer screen. But what we have here are, it's supposed to be purple. Wait, I'm sorry. Go back one, please. There. So here we have purple, and here we have green. And I'm very sorry that it's not clearer, but this is the whole population of an area, maybe a state, and maybe you could say each blob represents 100,000 people or something, but I want to keep it simple. So in this area where no district lines have been drawn yet, 40% of the voters are purple voters and 60% are green voters. Now somebody's going to draw the lines, and perhaps they drew the lines vertically, just like this. See, can you see the lines okay? Okay, so here what we do is we see that drawing the lines this way comes up with districts that have two good qualities. They're compact, meaning these people aren't scattered all over the place, they're still sort of living next to each other, and they're fair. What do I mean by fair? I mean that if you draw the lines this way, vertically, there will be 2 purple districts and 3 green districts, the same as the representation of all the voters. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, well then let's draw the lines horizontally. I mean, if it was fine vertically, why not just draw them horizontally? So here in the third box, we see them drawn horizontally. But in this case, just because of the distribution of people, look there are always 3 greens and 2 purples. 3 greens, 2 purples, 3 greens, 2 purples, 3 greens. So purple never wins, because every time that they're in every district that they're in, they're outnumbered by the other color. Now, you can get even worse, and this is what's really happening in Michigan and many other states. The districts are neither compact nor fair. Now, this is even more challenging to see, but I'm going to try to outline it. So here, each of these districts has 5 clumps of population in it, and you can see here what's going to happen here is that purple is going to rule, because purple's going to win 3 of them, and green's only going to win 2. Even though purple only has 40% of all the voters. So the way this is done, it's kind of similar to this one, only it's done in a more complicated manner, and it makes the districts not even compact. So here you see how the line has been drawn to carefully include 3 greens, I think, and 2 purples. Then down here, the next one is carefully drawn to have 3 and 2. The one down here is carefully drawn, and these are not compact, they're kind of squiggling around. And then down here we have another one, and then here we have all of the minority party. Is that right? Yes. Green. So the end result here is that we have 3 purple districts and 2 green ones. So purple rules, even though purple is only 40% of the people. Got it? Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, here are some applications of the 2 main actions that gerrymandering uses to accomplish the results that we saw on the previous slide. They're called cracking and packing. Cracking means spreading out the voters and drawing the lines in such a way that a community, and by community I could mean the poor people in a particular city, or the African Americans, or the Asians, or old people, a community of interest where they would be served by being adequately represented. Any kind of a minority, actually, this would apply to. So cracking, you divide up the purples. The colors look better here. Maybe it's because there's more white background. So here, the purples are all divided up, and they're put 2 of them in each district, and lo and behold, in each district there are 3 greens. So they're never going to win anything. Cracking, that's cracking. It's happened in Michigan. I'll show you some examples. Packing is sort of the other side of cracking. When you pack, you put most of the purples in the same district. Now this is good because it guarantees that they'll win 1, but what about all the others? Because now they've all been, so many have been packed in here that when you put the rest of them in the other 4 districts, they're outnumbered, 3 to 2, 4 to 1 down here, or they're not there at all over here. And that's a bad result. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're getting down to the actual maps. This is Michigan's congressional districts. We have, as I said, 14 Congress people, and each is elected from one of these districts, and the different colors are different districts. Because they have to have equal population, roughly speaking, let's see, there about 710,000 people in each district. Well, if you want to get up to 710,000 people in the northern part of the state, you cover a lot of territory. And I would not like to be knocking doors up there. But I'm now going to show you, thank you. This is one of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. This is Michigan's 14th congressional district. Now, one of the things about, one of the things you see on a map that indicates gerrymandering is a district that is not compact. Now, I know I'm on the other side of the state, but I'm sure you all know Pontiac is a fair distance from downriver Detroit. So having it be all spread out like this is a sure sign of gerrymandering. Another sure sign of gerrymandering, I'm sorry, it isn't funny, it's tragic, but is odd little, jig-jags. And here's the most astounding one, Farmington Hills. This is Farmington, okay? They want, and that's a relatively rich white, and they wanted those voters to be down here where they could have more influence. So they just cut them out of the 14th. But the worst part about the 14th is this is a perfect, well, nearly perfect example of packing. It's a packing of African Americans and it's a packing of poor people. And in the book that I highly recommend, and excuse me for the title, but I didn't write the title, it's called Rat Fucked. Rat Fucked is a politician's term for a dirty deed that comes cheap. And I will explain what that dirty deed was in a few minutes. But I want to use this district as an example. The author of that book drove all the way around the 14th district and he described what he saw. And he found that no matter where you pick along all these lines, on this side or down here or up here, the part of the road that has the 14th district on the side is obviously poorer. The cars are not there. If there are cars, they're ratty cars. Over here on the other side, big lawns, big trees, well managed. Another really weird thing is the way it goes up here, and that of course is the attempt to connect Pontiac, a pretty African American city, with African Americans that are here and that are here in Southfield, and so that they won't be out there polluting the results in the adjacent districts. So this is Michigan's 14th. It is 79% Democrat and 80% or more African American. Okay, next slide, we'll look over here. Here is Western Michigan, and of course I don't know this so well, and some of you may have comments on this, but here's a sign of gerrymandering right here. All this very careful drawing. It turns out that the 2nd district, which is the blue one here, is 81% white, 6% black, and 8% Hispanic. The 3rd over here is also 80% white, 9% black, and 7% Hispanic, pretty much the same. The Republicans won the 2nd district by 63% and the 3rd district by 59% in 2016. I suspect, and those of you who know this area better than I do, but I suspect that this is an example of cracking, that they've put half of the African Americans in one and half in the other, same with the Hispanics. So that's another example in our state of that happening. Now what I've been talking about here are congressional districts. And the next slide, we'll see the rubber hit the road. And don't hit send yet. This shows the U.S. House, this is the 2016 election results. The reds are the Republicans and the blues are the Democrats. And you can't see it, but I can if I get close enough. It's 48% red and 47% blue. So practically even, with 5% of the people voting elsewhere. So Republicans won 48% of the total votes cast for the U.S. House. Okay, return so we can see the other half of this slide. Oops.
How many seats did they win though?
That's the point. With 48% of the vote, they got 64% of the seats. And here you see it. Okay? That's accomplished by the way they drew those lines. Question?
Michigan.
This is Michigan, right. Now, as you will learn, this happened in many, many other states, and it happened very deliberately, and that's what the book is about.
Didn't the Supreme Court just throw it out in Philadelphia? The same kind of thing? Reversal or only for that case in Philadelphia is what my question is going to be.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with a case in Philadelphia. I am familiar with 1, 2, 3, or 4 cases that the U.S. Supreme Court has heard recently. No, 3 that the U.S. Supreme Court held. In Pennsylvania, which might be what you're thinking of, Pennsylvania, the League of Women Voters did a very smart thing. They brought their claim that the 2011 lines were gerrymandered in the state Supreme Court, because it happens that Pennsylvania has a stronger equivalent of the 14th Amendment than the US Constitution does. And they won in the state Supreme Court, and that can't be appealed to the US Supreme Court. And they ordered that the lines be redrawn. And they have been or will be redrawn, and that will affect fall election. It couldn't go to the US Supreme. Yep. No, that's okay. Thank you for bringing it up. Thank you very much for bringing it up. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now I quickly want to say, I've been talking about what the Republicans did, and I will continue to talk about what the Republicans did, but Democrats do it too. It's a natural thing for the party in power to do. So here we see 2012 congressional distribution in Maryland, where the Democrats are very, very, very much in power. And here we see the Republicans had 33% of the votes. And you think the Democrats would be okay with them having a third of their congressional delegation, but no, they only got 12.5%. Okay, the Democrats with 63% got 87 of the vote, got 87% of the seats. That's no more good for our democracy than what the Republicans did here. And I will illustrate some of the detrimental impacts of that in a few minutes. So could I see the other half of this slide? And this is Michigan in 2012, where the Republicans got 46% of the votes and a much higher percentage of the seats. Let's see, yeah, they had 46% of the votes, but got 64% of the seats, similar to the result most recently. Okay, we'll do the next slide, and now we've finished talking about congressional districts. Now we're talking about the Michigan Senate. What I'm going to do here is show you the Senate map and the vote results, and then the same thing for the Michigan House, because you'll see the same things happening, and I don't need to go into so much detail. The Michigan Senate has 38 members, and so their districts are smaller than the congressional ones. But they too are subject to being gerrymandered. And if it's a little hard to see on this map, but we see some of the same thing over here that we saw on the congressional one, and down here we see the same thing. Our senators are elected for 4 years, every year that there's a governor election, and they can serve only 2 terms. There are no term limits on members of Congress, because those are federal positions, but in the state, at the state level, each state can have term limits if it wants. I personally think term limits are a terrible idea, but that's not what I'm talking about. So let's go to the next slide and just show you the results. And I guess I'm going to have to read this to you too, but this is the first election to the Michigan Senate after the 2011 redistricting. And again, we see a virtual tie in terms of the number of voters, 51% over here and 49% here. But look at the election results. The Republicans got 71% of the seats, and the Democrats got only 29%. All right, next slide, and we'll look quickly at the State House. We have 110 elected members of the State House, so their districts are smaller geographically. Each one of those districts has between about 80 and 90,000 people, residents, not voters, residents. And the State House is elected to 2-year terms, and they can only serve 3 times, so that's a total of 6 years. And then let's go to the next. Here's the result. Again, pretty equally divided, 49.1, 49.2. And the next half, please. And you see that, again, the Republicans won more seats. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the consequences of this? One is that the seats won don't reflect the votes cast. This affects policies, and that's why it's important. It's not because it's some race to see who got more seats. It's because once they're sitting in those seats, they are making laws that affect all of us. And if they are so unrepresentative of the nature of the voting population, how can they do what the voters might want? And in Michigan, I will give you 2 examples of how the legislature deliberately undid things that the voters had asked for. The first one is the emergency manager law. The emergency manager law, I can't remember when it was first passed, but the voters did not like the emergency manager law once they saw how it was being applied and what the implications were. And of course, you don't need to be reminded that it was emergency managers who, to save money, switched the Flint water from Detroit to the Flint River. The voters did not like the emergency manager law, and I think it was in 2012, there was a referendum on the ballot, and the voters, by a large margin, voted the emergency manager law out. Because in Michigan, voters can put something on the ballot that way. And we're lucky to have a constitution that allows that. Not all states do. Well, that was in November. A few weeks later, what did the legislature do? They reenacted it. And you know what else they did? They attached an appropriation to it. And under the Michigan Constitution, something that has an appropriation attached to it is not subject to voter overrule.
But it wasn't a real appropriation because it wasn't like a department or something. It was a small amount of budget money.
Right, right. But it was enough
to...
Okay, the question is what that appropriation really was. And the questioner said that that wasn't a real appropriation. It wasn't appropriated for any functional reason or to any department, and that's correct. But it was enough to make it voter-proof. Then the second example, emergency manager law, straight ticket voting, which is really important. Remember we talked about the 14th district being largely Democratic? And it's got a lot of people living in a small area. You can have really long lines, and really long lines discourage voters because you're taking your half-hour lunch hour to vote, and you see a 2-hour long line, you're probably not going to vote. So the straight ticket voting was very important, and it hasn't happened yet, but the legislature is trying to undo that. That is something that the voters approved, and the legislature tried to undo it, and somebody filed a lawsuit, and that's now in limbo. So the straight ticket voting is still possible in Michigan, and that's a good thing for voters. You don't have to use it, but if you want to, you just check one box and go to the things at the end of the ballot, and you're done, rather than choosing office by office. So that's two examples of policies where the voters have clearly spoken and the legislature has deliberately done differently. Okay, next item. So the vast majority of districts are not competitive. I mean, that's the whole idea, right? They want to ensure that their side wins. And what does that do? That makes voters believe that their vote doesn't matter, because if it's not competitive, why would you vote? So the final one is this, that the party in power then is able to meet behind closed doors and draw lines that benefit it. So, next slide, please. This is our little motto, or a little logo, I should say. It's a fox in charge of the henhouse, and it's a conflict of interest for the people who are going to be elected to choose who the voters are that will vote for them. So, having seen this list of horrors, you may be wondering, how did this happen? This happened over the whole, I'm sorry, I was just reading some stuff that Obama had said about this. So after the 2008 election, the Republicans were really worried because a lot of Republican districts had voted for Obama, and they came to realize that the country was changing. The population was changing. The population was getting younger, becoming more diverse, and as they looked down the road, they didn't like what they saw. And one day, one of them, his name is Chris Jankowski, and he partnered up later with Karl Rove to develop what was called Red Map. So click, please. And Red Map is the Republicans' redistricting majority project. So Chris Jankowski was disconsolately reading the New York Times in November of 2008, and he came upon an article about the census, the 2010 census, and a light bulb went off, and he said, wait, we're going to redraw the lines, all the lines, in 2011 after the 2010 census is complete. So what they did is they decided, now you will learn in a minute that in 31 states it's the legislature that draws the lines. including Michigan, and they highlighted these states in particular where they wanted to take control away from the Democrats. But they also identified on a total of 107 seats in 16 states where they could, if they could take over the state legislature, they could then be the ones to draw the lines, and that would affect 190 congressional seats. And so that's what they did. Next, please. They targeted several states and the legislative races. Now, state legislative race can be rather cheap to win because they're small. There's not a lot of money put into advertising. So they used a combination of money and Karl Rove dirty tricks. For example, putting out a lie 2 days before the election about a candidate that there's no time to rebut. They did things like that. So that was step one, take over these state legislatures. Next, please. Number two, they did win in the states they wanted to win in, and they were able to draw their maps in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and so on. Now, these are the states where the cases are gradually going to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Wisconsin case was the first one. The Pennsylvania case was in the Pennsylvania courts. North Carolina had one lawsuit about gerrymandering based on racial lines. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Based on racial lines, and those lines were thrown out. And they also, they had a case about gerrymandering more generally that wasn't based on race, and so that one is still bouncing back and forth between the Supreme Court and the state of North Carolina. So in their annual report, Red Map people wrote that among other things, in Michigan, 65-42 Democratic majority was flipped so that the Republicans picked up 20 seats in the leadership of the House. Okay, so that was a very deliberate act and created the gerrymandering that we have in Michigan. That gerrymandering, by the way, could you go back one? So you know, they say that Trump won because he breached the blue wall. The blue wall is Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And he won those states by very, very small margins, but he still got the electoral votes. And those are pretty populous states with you know, fairly large number of electoral votes, electoral college votes. And so that paid off. And I think in Michigan, I think he won by 10,000 votes. And that was the smallest of those 4 states, but it was under 100,000 votes in each case. Okay, next slide.
Can I say something?
Oh, well, of course.
Yeah, Trump said that the election was rigged against him.
Yes, he did.
When actually all these states had been flipped because of what Chris Jankowski did
Correct.
in 2008. So really it was to his benefit.
Right, right. So the question was about Trump's statement that prior to the results of the election, his statement that the election was rigged and that if he lost it was because it was rigged. And the questioner pointed out that in fact it was rigged in his favor.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to the solution because enough of this sadness. So the general change that has to be made is to change the rules so that the process is fair, transparent, and impartial. And that means taking it out of the hands of the legislature and having some other group do it. So let's look at the next slide. And here are the options, or at least the options as they have been implemented around the country. 31 states, as I said, use the legislature. This means a legislative committee creates the map and then gives it to the legislature, and it's just like a regular bill, a bill for an act to draw congressional district lines. There is a subcategory of these which might be that the legislature delegates that to an advisory committee that the legislature has chosen, but it's still subject to legislative approval. So these are really just 2 variations of the same thing. Another sort of politician-oriented solution is that the legislature would designate other elected officials to make up a commission and draw the final plan, and that would not have to be approved by the legislature. 7 states have that. So a total of 36 have some version of the legislature doing it. 7 have this. There are now 6 states that have an independent commission, and I will talk more about that in a minute. But this is where citizens draw the maps with no approval from the legislature required. And I'll say more about what that really looks like. There's another possibility, but there's only 1 state that does it this way. Iowa is a nice enough place that the nonpartisan legislative staff are truly nonpartisan, and the legislature trusts them, and the citizens trust them, and so that nonpartisan legislative staff draws the lines. And I think that's possible because of the high degree of trust that's been built up over the years, but also because I think Iowa is still a pretty homogeneous state. So I have not seen anyone proposing that that be done in Michigan. Okay, next slide, please. Here are 2 examples of independent commission in California. There are 14 members, and you can see how they're divided up. They held 34 public hearings, 22,000 written comments, and everything was in public. Arizona did theirs prior to when California did, and Arizona has a much smaller commission, which the voters approved having, and which actually did draw lines recently. There was a group that really, really, really did not like this change, and they sued and sued and sued, all the way up to the US Supreme Court. You know who it was? Come on. Come on. The legislature.
Legislature?
Yeah. Yeah, they said, this is our job. We were elected by the people, and the people should trust us to draw the lines.
Where does it say it's their job? I mean, the lines have to be redrawn, but where does it say the legislature has to do it?
The question was, where does it say the legislature has to do it? I haven't looked this up, but I would say it was either in the Constitution, and the voters approved a constitutional amendment, or as in Michigan, it was a statute that the legislature itself had passed. But it was overcome by voters voting for a change. Okay, let's look at California a little more carefully on the next slide. The Common Cause is one of the groups that has been pushing for these independent commissions, and they did a survey to discover what the results in California were. And so we can just click them off here. Increased voter confidence, because the districts are now more competitive, because the voters had more confidence that their vote would count. Guess what? More of them voted, which is a good result. There's also less partisan bias and greater accountability because everybody knows who's drawn the lines, and it's been done in public. And in fact, this increase in competitive seats, I need to fix this slide, it tripled. The number of districts that were truly competitive tripled. Now there are other things that are happening in California elections that might have affected some of this. You've heard about their jungle primaries, and I won't get into that, but these are positive results in California. Okay, what could we do in Michigan? There are 2 possibilities. The first one is that legislatures could propose a change and get it on the ballot and let us vote on it. Ain't gonna happen right now. Or, luckily in Michigan we have something called the initiative, which means that voters can create a solution to a problem they've identified. And that's what's been done. And the wonderful group called Voters Not Politicians, we'll see on the next slide what they've done. They formed a committee in February of 2017 and to create a ballot question committee, and then they got to work and figured out what their ballot proposal would actually say about how the Constitution should be changed. And in December, this was a really remarkable thing they did. In December, you'll see that they started in August collecting signatures, and by December 20th, they turned in over 400,000 signatures, which this slide is also out of date. The Secretary of State reviewed the signatures and determined that there were more than enough of them that were valid, that this should go on the ballot. Normally, the next step would be that the ballot commission, which consists of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, would work out the 100-word summary that would actually appear on the ballot. I don't believe they've started to work on that yet, because in the meantime, some of the same people who were involved in drawing those maps in secret in 2011 have formed a committee called something like People to Protect the Constitution. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact name, but it's something like that. And they are funded with a fair amount of dark money, meaning money that can't be traced back to the people who gave it. And they have filed a lawsuit to stop the VNP proposal from getting on the ballot. Their argument is that the VNP proposal affects so many different parts of the Constitution that it should be done by a constitutional, that the whole Constitution should be reviewed completely by a constitutional convention. I don't know whether they're going to win that argument, and I'm afraid I don't know where that stands right now. So why don't we go to the next slide and learn a little bit about it. Now, I will say this about their proposal. It's really complicated and long, and I hope that that won't be a deterrent, but it certainly will be an argument that the opposition will use. It sets up it's modeled on California, and it sets up an independent commission, and you can see the numbers up there, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats and 5 independents. Now in California, people register to vote as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, I don't know, a libertarian, a socialist, whatever. And so you can identify what people's party is. In Michigan, that's not the case. We don't register by party. So they have to have a complicated process for figuring out who's a Democrat and who's a Republican. Then once the commission is formed, and all of this would be done by the Secretary of State, and it will cost money because somebody has to do all this work. So that's going to be another argument against it. So they have to it requires public hearings like in California, and everything has to be revealed to the public, and their meetings have to be in public. They have to reveal the formulas they use. They have to talk about the computer programs that they use, and the rules down here are designed to prevent one party from controlling the process. And you can go to votersnotpoliticians.com to find out more about that. So how about the League? Let's see what the League of Women Voters of Michigan. We support an independent redistricting, and I'm sure you all know that. It's in the policy book. The League also believes that a successful ballot proposal has to be supported by a coalition that represents the diversity of the state. At the moment, there is no coalition. There are a number of groups that are very, very interested in having a coalition. The League of Women Voters, the ACLU, the NAACP, environmental groups, variety of other minority groups, but so far there's not a coalition. Yeah, the League is still trying to do that, and we're continuing to educate voters. And here's the next wonderful thing that the League has done, and I hope you all know about this already. They filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State, Ruth Johnson, who's the one who carries out elections, and they are joined by 11 other plaintiffs who are individual voters scattered across the state, voters who live in districts in which their vote has basically been denied because of the way the district is gerrymandered, and makes 2 assertions that the maps were drawn in a secretive partisan process, and that objective analysis of the votes shows that the districts were drawn to systematically crack and pack the voters. And this lawsuit is being tried in the federal district court in Detroit, and there's a 3-judge panel, and from what I have read, they're good judges. The judges seem to be treating the League complaint seriously. The judges, for example, asked both parties, that is the state and the League, to submit a proposed schedule for how this would move through the court, because it really has to be handled pretty expeditiously, and yet there's a huge amount of discovery to be done because the whole thing was done in secret. So how are you going to find out how it was done? They're going to have to subpoena people and depose people, and it's going to be expensive. Anyway, I was giving an example of the judges adopting the League's position. The League submitted a very aggressive schedule for the trial and other steps in this case. And of course, the defendant submitted like a turtle speed schedule, and the judges quickly chose the League's schedule. So right now, this is scheduled to go to trial on February 19th. What the lawsuit...
next year?
February of 2019. And it asks the court to declare the current districts unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering and to ensure that the districts are redrawn in a fair manner. So maybe we could go to the next slide. And let's go to the next slide and I'll wrap it up. And then I want to say one more thing about the League lawsuit. So this is what has happened. Politicians are manipulating the process. This is a conflict of interest. We should have a fair, transparent, impartial method next session. And then finally, because when we vote, we want our votes to count and our elections to be fair so that our voices can be heard. And probably a more summarized way of saying that is we can't really have a democracy if votes don't count. And I was just reading in this book I recommend to you about North Carolina, which somebody developed a 20-question or a 50-question method for determining how democratic a jurisdiction really was. And if you apply that to some of the relatively undeveloped countries that are really dictatorships, you know, they flunk. But you know what? North Carolina got only 50 out of 100 points on that test. And that's not good. That's what happens when the districts are gerrymandered. People lose trust in the process. Now, because it's probably going to be a question anyway, I want to say a little bit about the relationship between the League's lawsuit, which is about the current lines, and the Voter Not Politicians proposal, which is about the future. They are not incompatible with each other. They are, in fact, mutually supportive. If the VNP proposal passes, that will affect who draws the lines in 2021 that would be used in the 2022 elections and going forward. If the League wins its case, the lines would have to be redrawn kind of now, like before the election in 2020. Because the election in 2020, if we go back to Red Map, Red Map happened in 2010, where Republicans deliberately took over the state legislature so they could redraw the lines. If the League wins its case in Michigan, those lines would be redrawn before the 2020 election, which is the key point, because then the 2020 election is much less likely to result in one party winning purely because the lines were gerrymandered. If we get fairer lines drawn, we will have a better legislature, a more, better, that's the wrong word. We will have a legislature that will more accurately and completely reflect what the voters think than the current one does. And that means that even if the VNP didn't pass, we would have better lines drawn. So that's why they're sort of mutual. So if the League loses its case and VNP wins, then things will get fixed in time for the 2022 election. And if, well, I've said all the possibilities. So questions. Now, what I'm going to do when you ask a question is I'm going to repeat the question because this is being recorded, and you all don't have mics on. So you had a question.
Say the Voters Not Politicians passes. What is going to stop the legislature from changing that like they did the straight ballot voting ticket, you know, that we have voted in twice and they've thrown out twice? Well, this is harder for them to change because it's a constitutional amendment. It's not just a statute. And so it would have to follow one of the two methods for amending the Michigan Constitution that I had a slide about. Method one is the legislature initiates it. The change has to be passed by 2/3 of the legislature, and then it has to be passed by the voters. Thank you.
Okay.
I was on the voters website and went on to, it took me to Michigan Radio, and it said that as of a report 21 hours ago, that this lawsuit, Citizens Protecting Michigan's Constitution, the group behind the lawsuit challenging the proposal, is appealing to the Michigan Supreme Court. So
Okay.
that means
It's not finished yet.
it's not.
So what the comment
They
was,
lost the first step,
Right,
and they're
right.
appealing.
so what the audience member said was that she looked this up and found a Michigan radio report from 11 hours ago, 21 hours ago, that said the opponents of the VNP proposal had lost in the, I guess, the Court of Appeals, and were appealing to the Michigan Supreme Court. Another question, and make your question concise, and then I'll repeat it, and then I'll answer it.
I'm a volunteer with Voters Not Politicians.
Good for you.
I am a presenter. So my request to all of you is that if you have a group, a club, a church organization, any group of people whom you would like to understand this horrible process that's happening, please let me know. I can leave my phone number in the back, but we are open to visiting and presenting with anyone. We give a 20-minute presentation. The other thing
Wait, I'm sorry, but I'm sympathetic to the audience that may be watching this later. The audience member is part of Voters Not Politicians. They have a 20-minute presentation that they give, and she's offering to give it to any of you who are interested, and you can see her afterwards. I have to say the League has a presentation that you've just seen, and I'm from Ann Arbor, and I came here to do it. I have a stable of 15 or 20 trained speakers in Washtenaw County, but we are willing to go to other counties so long as that other county doesn't have a League group that can support that.
Fabulous. And then the other thing, it seems to me if it's so important that we get this on the midterm ballot in 2018 so that we can vote for it by 2020.
Right.
The gerrymandering could be cleared up by then.
Right, right. So it's very important to vote in the midterm election. Another question.
Actually, a comment.
Sure.
The Arizona legislature that sued to prevent the Arizona redistricting, that legislature was under the control of the Republican Party pretty much from time out of mind, and still is.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact vote on that particular act of the legislature that caused that lawsuit.
It was the legislature that sued.
Yes, and I don't know how many Democrats voted in favor of suing.
I don't.
Since the Republicans dominate that legislature, it was clearly a primarily Republican move to try to prevent gerrymandering.
I think wait 1 second. I want to. The audience member is talking about the fact that the Arizona legislature has been for a long, long time Republican dominated.
Yes. I think this is part of a more general trend we see across the country, in which Republicans find that allowing one voter to have one vote and to have no gerrymandering is dangerous to the Republican Party's existence and long-term prosperity.
And the audience member points out that it appears that Republicans feel that letting each voter have a vote is contrary to their best interests. And they are showing that in many other ways. For example, voter suppression, making it harder to vote, making it take longer to vote. They have succeeded in diminishing the turnout of minority groups and even of Democrats significantly by making it harder to vote. Now that's sort of a different issue from this, for what I've been talking about, but it is another consequence of the gerrymandering, because a legislature that truly reflected the will of people in this country, I do not believe that people in this country want to suppress voting. I'm sure we don't want illegal immigrants, non-citizens to vote. I'm sure we want people to follow the rules, but there's no reason to take away the golden week that they had in one of the states where you could vote early. And in fact, that reminds me, you know about Promote the Vote, the League's others, so Promote the Vote is very important too. That's probably or will be on the ballot. I think they turned the signatures into the Secretary of State, and I don't know the result of that. But that's another one. Very simple things. You can get an absentee ballot without being old or crippled or sick or in Timbuktu. It's just very simple things that I collected signatures for that one. And it was so easy to get people to sign. I mean, it's just simple to get people, even though it's got a lot of pieces to it. The whole idea is make it easier to vote. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
I believe just recently the Attorney General of the United States suggested that something that is not opposed after so many then they reduce the right to vote. And you work in this place registry, often respond to question that one.
Yeah. The audience member commented on the concept, which is actually being used in some states, that if you don't vote X number of times or X number of years, that they'll send you a postcard, and if the postcard doesn't come back, they will cut your name off the registration lists. There's something in the way in which Michigan is more liberal than many other states, in that a felon who's completed their sentence, his or her sentence, can vote in Michigan. And that's one of the things that I'm sure you know the League has been promoting. When we go out to register voters, we have a big sign that says, you know, if you're a felon and you finished your sentence, you can vote. And I was registering people over in Ypsilanti a few weeks ago, and a young man came up and thanked us for putting that sign up. He said, I'm a felon. I've served my sentence. You know, I've gotten sober. I'm not committing crimes anymore, and I'm so grateful that I can vote. So the question was whether I believe that gerrymandering has driven the parties to extremes, and I would say yes. I think what you say is exactly right. The true election now is in the primary, and where I live in Ann Arbor, that's true even for our city council seats. And who votes on August 7th in a university town? Only the most impassioned ones. But no, I think you're right about that. I'm going on, I think, longer than I should. So I would just like to say one more thing. Many of the audiences that we talk to in Washtenaw County don't really need to learn all this. But I gave a presentation to a church group in a small town west of Ann Arbor, more out in the farming country, and those people were outraged. They had never heard anything about this. They didn't know anything, and I'm not criticizing them. It's a somewhat arcane topic, and if you're in the League of Women Voters, you probably are sort of aware of it already. But to pick up on the point from the VNP member and the other VNP member, it's important to get out to groups that aren't just like us. It's important to get out to other groups before these well-funded people get their yard signs up and get their billboards up. And I think that they could raise enough money to defeat this. Because think of who cares about this. It's all the big corporate money in Michigan. So anyway, thank you very much for being such a great audience.